Suddenly, out of Tokyo came a new proposal, courtesy of a member of the influential Privy Council. Count Kentaro Kaneko suggested a Japanese-American commission to iron out the Pacific deadlock. Kaneko, 88 years old, was respected and a student of American culture. He suggested officials from various walks of life be appointed to the commission. The New York Times saw hope in the proposal, writing, "An impression prevailed in diplomatic circles that something approaching a status quo may have been reached temporarily that might permit the exploratory conversations to continue with less disturbance." However, Japanese nationals were being hurriedly withdrawn from Panama, British North Borneo, Malaya, India, Ceylon, and other countries, just as they had already begun withdrawing diplomats from Mexico. Also, the Japanese Institute in New York announced abruptly that it would close, and the director and his immediate staff would depart for home, while another 132 Japanese nationals applied for passage back to Japan. However, approximately 2,000 Japanese nationals in the greater New York area had no plans to repatriate as far as anybody knew. A government spokesman in Tokyo, Tomokazu Horai, held a press conference and said it was all just one big misunderstanding on the part of the United States government regarding our policy in the Far East. Washington seems to allege that we are following a policy of force and conquest and establishing a military despotism. Australia had some reason to believe that about the Japanese and hastily reconvened their war cabinet as a result, because the Pacific crisis had reached a new and graver stage. All Christmas leaves were canceled for Aussie troops. 1 million gas masks for the civilian population were ordered, and their naval ships were being conveyed to the Pacific. Though an official said all the precautions did not mean that war is inevitable with Japan, but there was internal debate in Australia over the government's power to conscript men of fighting age, and whether Australians should fight for England just as there had been during the Great War. The Aussie Labour Party opposed the draft, declaring a volunteer army is always more effective. War measures were also taking place in Thailand, the most directly menaced, as well as the Netherlands East Indies. The Churchill government implemented its own emergency measures in the Far East, including recalling all fighting men to their posts in Singapore and prepared for a state of readiness. The British referred to Singapore as their Gibraltar of the Orient. It was announced the sale of gasoline would be suspended in Shanghai, which would become a virtual ghost town, as commercial shipping had slowed to nothingness over the past several months. Those not of British ancestry were forbidden from leaving British Malaya, and rumors swirled that Manila would soon be evacuated of non-combatants. The Associated Press also reported, without explanation, Japan recalled 2 attachés of the Japanese government in Washington. The German radio identified them as military attachés, Colonel Tadamori and Lieutenant Colonel Arayu Muhida. In character, the Australian government issued a blunt statement. "We are fully alive to the Japanese threat and are not afraid of it." The pro-West Chinese government of Chiang Kai-shek also issued a statement, predictably leveling Tokyo, calling its response to FDR an insult to the intelligence of the American people. Many in the West felt that the combined military forces of the ABCD powers, as Tokyo called them, American, British, China, Dutch, were more than a match for the Japanese should they press on with their invasion. And consolidation of the Far East in the Philippines alone, there were a dozen divisions, 1 American and 11 Filipino, several hundred planes, 2 heavy cruisers, several destroyers, and 18 submarines. Douglas MacArthur was confident his forces would repel any Japanese attack on the Philippines, and that he was well prepared to meet land onslaughts from the Japanese in the event that military folly leads Japan to war with the United States. The air arm of America is a long one. From the Philippines, it can sweep to and over Japan with ease, and back to its insular bases. But Japanese air officials brushed off MacArthur's swagger, authoritatively pointing out that the B-17 planes under his command were of the older B and C types with a range of 2,200 miles, which is insufficient to Japan from Manila and return. Some, however, were worried instead about the power of the Japanese fleet and counseled a more aggressive posture by the American Navy. The notion was floated of moving the American fleet stationed at Pearl Harbor to the Philippines to help MacArthur stave off an invasion, but this could not be brought to the Philippines without great danger because the cruising range of the fleet is only 2,500 miles, and it would be necessary to make one jump of more than that distance without refueling. This would be a risky operation, for it would require the use of the whole American battle fleet and would leave the West Coast open to Japanese raiders. It probably will not be tried. And we'll pause there.